Hey there, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're diving into something that'll make your worst Monday morning feel like a tropical vacation. We're talking about surviving the Black Death, and trust me, the key word here is surviving, because as you'll discover, sometimes making it through was worse than not making it at all. Before we get started, hit that like button if you're ready for a journey through one of history's darkest chapters, and subscribe if you enjoy content that doesn't sugarcoat the past. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing our global community come together, even when we're discussing medieval nightmares. Now grab your favorite beverage, get comfortable, and let's step into the shoes of someone living through humanity's most devastating pandemic. Picture this. It's 1347. You're living in a cramped European town, and death has just knocked on your neighbor's door. Not metaphorically, literally. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it transformed the very fabric of society, turning everyday life into a horror show that lasted for years. And here's the thing, most history books gloss over. The real nightmare wasn't dying from the plague. It was living through it. Let's start with what actually happened when the plague arrived in your town. Imagine waking up one morning to find your neighbor's door hasn't opened in 3 days. No smoke rising from their chimney. No children playing in their yard. Just silence. That eerie, heavy silence that settles over a place where life used to be. The first wave of the Black Death swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351. Killing an estimated 75 to 200 million people. That's roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's entire population, gone within 4 years. But these numbers, as staggering as they are, barely scratch the surface of what daily life became for those who remained. You see, the plague didn't announce itself with fanfare. It crept in quietly, usually through trade routes, carried by merchant ships that docked in bustling ports. These vessels, loaded with goods from distant lands, also carried unwanted passengers. Rats infested with fleas that harboured the deadly Yersinia pestis bacteria. The rats would scurry off the ships, spreading through the narrow, filthy streets of medieval towns. Within days, sometimes hours, the first cases would appear. A merchant would collapse in the marketplace, blood trickling from his nose. A child would develop a fever that wouldn't break. A mother would discover dark, painful swellings under her arms. But here's where it gets truly horrifying for the survivors. The plague came in 3 distinct forms, each more terrifying than the last. Bubonic plague caused those infamous buboes, swellings in the lymph nodes that could grow as large as apples. Victims would develop black patches on their skin, giving the disease its sinister name. This form killed about 60% of those infected, but it took days or weeks to do it. Then there was septicemic plague, where the bacteria invaded the bloodstream directly. This turned the skin black and blue, causing people to die within hours. But the most feared variant was pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs and could spread through coughing and breathing. This airborne version could kill within 24 hours. And had a mortality rate approaching 100%. Imagine being a survivor in a town where any of these 3 killers could strike at any moment. Every cough from a neighbor sent chills down your spine. Every fever in a child made you wonder if your family would be next. Every knock on your door could be someone asking for help with bodies that needed removing. The speed of death was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect for survivors. Medieval people were accustomed to death, but they were used to the slow progression of normal illnesses. The plague turned death into something sudden, violent, and seemingly random. A healthy person could be joking with friends at breakfast and dead by sunset. This unpredictability created a constant state of terror among survivors. Sleep became elusive because nightmares mixed with the very real sounds of suffering echoing through thin walls. Eating became mechanical because food lost its taste when seasoned with fear. Even simple pleasures like conversation became strained because no one wanted to discuss the obvious. Who would be next? The social fabric began unraveling almost immediately. Traditional hierarchies crumbled as death showed no respect for wealth or status. Peasants watched lords die in agony, while seemingly healthy beggars walked past noble corpses. This randomness shattered the medieval belief that social position reflected divine favor. Religious faith, the cornerstone of medieval life, faced its greatest test. Churches that promised divine protection became morgues. Priests who claimed special connection to God died alongside their parishioners. Some clergy fled their posts entirely, abandoning their communities in their darkest hour. Others remained but lost their minds, preaching increasingly desperate and contradictory sermons about God's wrath and mercy. For survivors, this spiritual crisis cut deeper than physical suffering. If God wouldn't protect the faithful, what was the point of faith? If prayers went unanswered while children died in their mother's arms, what was the point of prayer? Many survivors found themselves spiritually adrift, clinging to superstitions and folk remedies that at least felt like action in the face of helplessness. The economic system collapsed as dramatically as the social order. When half your workforce dies within months, commerce grinds to a halt. Shops closed not because owners chose to, but because their owners were dead. Fields went unharvested because entire families of farmers had perished. Trade routes that had connected Europe for centuries became highways of death, avoided by any merchant with sense. For survivors, this economic devastation meant basic necessities became luxury items. Bread disappeared from markets, not because grain was scarce, but because bakers were dead or dying. Clean water became precious because the people who maintained wells and aqueducts were gone. Even simple tools became irreplaceable treasures because craftsmen had taken their skills to the grave. But perhaps the cruelest twist for survivors was the way the plague transformed human relationships. In a world where anyone could be a carrier of death, trust became dangerous. Families turned away sick relatives, not out of cruelty, but out of desperate self-preservation. Neighbors who had shared meals and stories for decades suddenly viewed each other as potential threats. Love itself became a liability. Caring for someone meant risking infection. Touching became terrifying. Even the most basic human comfort, physical contact, could be a death sentence. Survivors lived in a world where isolation was survival, where showing compassion could literally kill you. Children who survived face perhaps the greatest psychological trauma. Many became orphans overnight, watching their entire families succumb while they remained mysteriously healthy. These child survivors often had to fend for themselves in a world that had lost most of its adults. They learned to scavenge, to hide, to distrust, and to accept death as routine. Their childhood ended not gradually, but violently, replaced by a premature adulthood focused solely on staying alive. The sensory assault on survivors was relentless. The smell of death became inescapable, clinging to clothes and hair. The sound of coughing echoed from every building, mixed with prayers, screams, and eventually, silence. Even taste was affected, as stress and fear altered appetites and made familiar foods seem foreign. Visual trauma haunted survivors daily. Bodies piled in streets because there weren't enough living people to bury them properly. Mass graves became commonplace, with corpses thrown in without ceremony or identification. Survivors might recognize a familiar face among the dead, then watch it disappear under lime and soil with dozens of strangers. The plague also triggered waves of violence and scapegoating that survivors witnessed or participated in. Communities sought someone to blame for their suffering, often targeting minority groups, foreigners, or anyone who seemed different. Jewish communities faced particularly brutal persecution, accused of poisoning wells or consorting with devils. Survivors watched neighbors they'd known for years transform into violent mobs, adding human cruelty to nature's devastation. Medical knowledge of the time was utterly inadequate for understanding or treating the plague. Doctors relied on theories about bad air, unbalanced humours, and divine punishment. Their treatments often made symptoms worse. Bloodletting weakened already sick patients, while burning herbs and spices did nothing to stop bacterial infection. For survivors, this medical ignorance meant watching loved ones receive treatments that seemed more like torture. They saw physicians in their bizarre bird-like masks, carrying long sticks to avoid touching patients, offering remedies that helped no one. The failure of medicine left survivors feeling abandoned, not just by God, but by human knowledge itself. The plague's psychological impact on survivors manifested in ways that wouldn't be understood for centuries. What we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder was simply accepted as the new normal. Survivors lived with constant anxiety, intrusive memories, emotional numbness, and hypervigilance. They startled at sudden sounds, avoided crowded places, and struggled to form new relationships. Some survivors developed what chroniclers called plague madness, exhibiting bizarre behaviors like compulsive hand-washing, hoarding food, or refusing to sleep indoors. Others became obsessed with death, creating elaborate rituals around avoiding infection or preparing for their own demise. These weren't character flaws, but trauma responses to unimaginable horror. The plague also created a generation gap unlike any in human history. Young survivors found themselves inheriting responsibilities, property, and social positions they were unprepared for. Teenagers became heads of households, inheriting trades they barely understood. Children had to make adult decisions about survival, resource allocation, and community leadership. Yet amidst all this horror, some survivors discovered unexpected opportunities. With traditional hierarchies shattered, social mobility became possible for the first time in centuries. A peasant might inherit land from a dead lord, or a servant might take over their master's business. The plague, while devastating, also redistributed wealth and power in ways that would have been unthinkable before. But these opportunities came with a price. Success felt hollow when achieved through others' deaths. Prosperity built on mass graves carried a psychological weight that many survivors struggled to bear. They lived with survivor's guilt, wondering why they deserved to live when better people had died. The landscape itself bore witness to the plague's devastation. Entire villages stood empty, their buildings slowly crumbling as nature reclaimed them. Survivors traveling between towns would pass through these ghost settlements, seeing evidence of interrupted lives everywhere. Half-finished meals on tables, children's toys scattered in yards, gardens growing wild without tenders. These abandoned places haunted survivors' dreams and waking hours alike. They served as constant reminders that civilization itself was fragile, that everything they took for granted could disappear within weeks. The physical scars on the landscape mirrored the emotional scars carried by those who remained. As we'll explore in the next part of this series, surviving the initial outbreak was just the beginning. The plague would return in waves, each bringing fresh trauma to communities that were still healing from the last assault. And perhaps most challenging of all, survivors had to figure out how to rebuild not just their towns and economies, but their very understanding of what it meant to be human in a world that had shown them how quickly everything could end. The Black Death didn't just kill bodies, it killed assumptions, traditions, and the basic trust that tomorrow would be like today. For those who lived through it, survival wasn't victory. It was simply the beginning of a different kind of struggle, one that would reshape European civilization for centuries to come. The psychological warfare didn't end with the first wave. No, that was just the opening act. What came next was perhaps even more insidious: the waiting. Because here's what no one tells you about surviving a pandemic in the 14th century. It never really ended. It just paused, like a predator catching its breath before the next hunt. Picture yourself as a survivor in 1352. The worst seems to be over. Bodies have been buried, shops are slowly reopening, and people are cautiously emerging from their homes. You might even catch yourself smiling at a neighbor's joke or enjoying the taste of fresh bread. Then someone mentions that strange ship that docked last week, or that merchant who seemed a bit pale, and suddenly that familiar ice-cold dread creeps back into your chest. The plague returned in waves, sometimes every few years, sometimes after a decade of false peace. Each resurgence brought fresh terror because survivors knew exactly what was coming. They'd lived through the horror once and understood that their previous survival had been luck, not immunity. The anticipation became its own form of torture. During these intervals between outbreaks, survivors developed what we might call hypervigilance. Every cough in church made them tense. Every fever in a child triggered memories they desperately wanted to forget. They learned to read the early signs. Unusual numbers of dead rats in the streets, ships arriving from infected ports, the particular quality of silence that settled over neighborhoods where death had begun its work. This constant state of alertness was exhausting. Imagine never being able to fully relax, never trusting that safety would last. Survivors became expert observers of human behavior, watching for the telltale signs of infection in everyone around them. A slight pallor, labored breathing, the way someone held themselves when walking, all became potential death sentences to be decoded. The trauma manifested in countless ways. Some survivors became compulsive cleaners, scrubbing their homes with vinegar and salt until their hands cracked and bled. Others hoarded food and medicine obsessively, storing supplies in hidden caches throughout their homes. Many developed elaborate personal rituals they believed would protect them, from wearing specific amulets to reciting particular prayers at exact times of day. Sleep became elusive for most survivors. When they did manage to rest, nightmares plagued their dreams. They'd wake screaming about loved ones reaching out with blackened fingers, or find themselves reliving the moment they discovered a family member's body. The boundary between memory and dream blurred, making even rest feel dangerous. The social fabric that had once bound communities together unraveled in ways that lasted generations. Trust, that fundamental ingredient of human society, became a luxury few could afford. Survivors lived in a world where helping others might mean dooming yourself, where showing compassion could literally be fatal. Marriage, once a celebration of union and hope, transformed into something more calculated. Young people paired off not just for love, but for survival. Two sets of hands were better than one for the countless tasks of daily life. Childbearing became urgent in communities where entire bloodlines had been extinguished. But even these unions carried shadows, as partners wondered whether they were marrying someone who might bring death into their home. Children born after the plague grew up in a world shaped by their parents' trauma. These parents, having witnessed the fragility of life firsthand, often became either overprotective or emotionally distant. Some couldn't bear to love their children too deeply, fearing the pain of loss. Others smothered them with anxious care, trying to shield them from dangers that existed more in memory than reality. The economic recovery, when it came, brought its own psychological challenges. As labor became scarce, survivors found themselves in unprecedented positions of power. Peasants could demand wages their grandfathers never dreamed of. Servants could choose their employers. Young people inherited property and responsibilities far beyond their years or experience. But this newfound prosperity felt tainted. Success built on mass graves carried a weight that many found unbearable. Survivors struggled with guilt over their good fortune, wondering why they deserved to prosper when better people had perished. Some gave away their windfall inheritances, unable to enjoy wealth that felt purchased with others' blood. The relationship between survivors and their physical environment became complicated in ways that persisted for decades. Certain buildings, streets, or even entire neighborhoods became associated with trauma. A house where a family had died might stand empty for years, not because it was structurally unsound, but because no one could bear to live where such suffering had occurred. Graveyards expanded dramatically, transforming the landscape of European towns and cities. These weren't the neat, organized cemeteries we might imagine, but sprawling fields of hastily dug graves, many unmarked, most holding multiple bodies. For survivors, these places became unavoidable reminders of loss, yet also necessary spaces for whatever grieving rituals they could manage. The church, once the center of community life, never fully recovered its authority among many survivors. How could they trust an institution that had promised protection, but delivered only platitudes while children died? Some survivors turned to alternative forms of spirituality, seeking answers in folk traditions, mysticism, or emerging humanistic philosophies that placed human reason above divine will. Others doubled down on religious fervor, interpreting their survival as evidence of divine favor or special purpose. These survivors often became obsessed with penance, convinced that only perfect piety could protect them from future outbreaks. They joined flagellant movements, starved themselves through excessive fasting, or donated everything they owned to religious institutions. The very concept of planning for the future became psychologically fraught. Why plant a garden if plague might return before harvest? Why build a house if your family might not survive to live in it? Many survivors lived in a state of perpetual temporariness, unable to invest emotionally in long-term projects or relationships. Yet humans are remarkably adaptable creatures, and survivors gradually developed coping mechanisms. They created new rituals around death that acknowledged its randomness, while still providing comfort. They formed loose communities of fellow survivors who understood their particular form of trauma without need for explanation. They learned to find meaning in small acts of kindness and moments of beauty amid ongoing uncertainty. Some survivors became obsessed with documentation, compulsively recording names of the dead, details of their symptoms, or theories about what might prevent future outbreaks. This wasn't just historical preservation, it was a psychological necessity. By writing down what they'd witnessed, survivors could process their experiences and maintain some sense of control over chaos. The arts provided another outlet for processing trauma. Survivors created haunting works that depicted death as an ever-present companion, from elaborate sculptures showing skeletons leading dances to paintings where corpses mingled with the living. These weren't morbid curiosities, but necessary expressions of a worldview forever altered by mass death. Language itself changed among survivors. New words entered common usage to describe experiences for which no vocabulary had previously existed. The way people spoke about time, relationships, and hope shifted subtly but profoundly. Conversations carried undercurrents of shared knowledge about how quickly everything could disappear. Personal hygiene practices transformed as survivors desperately sought ways to protect themselves from future infection. They developed elaborate cleansing rituals, burned specific herbs in their homes, and avoided certain foods or behaviors they associated with sickness. Whether these practices had any medical value mattered less than the psychological comfort they provided. The relationship between survivors and animals became complicated. Since rats had carried the plague, many people developed lasting phobias about rodents that bordered on panic. Dogs and cats, initially blamed and slaughtered during the outbreak, were gradually recognized as helpful in controlling rat populations. But even beneficial animals carried associations with the plague years that many survivors never fully overcame. Weather patterns that coincided with outbreaks became triggers for anxiety. Certain combinations of heat and humidity, particular wind patterns, or seasonal changes could send survivors into spirals of dread as they remembered similar conditions during plague years. The natural world itself became a source of constant interpretation and worry. Food took on new meanings beyond mere sustenance. Meals became rituals of gratitude for survival, but also reminders of those no longer present to share them. Survivors often struggled with appetite, finding that stress and grief altered their relationship with eating. Some hoarded food obsessively while others ate mechanically, deriving no pleasure from what had once brought joy. The concept of home was forever changed for plague survivors. A home wasn't just shelter, it was a fortress against disease and death. Survivors became obsessive about controlling who entered their spaces, how goods were cleaned before being brought inside, and maintaining what they believed were protective barriers against infection. Sleep schedules shifted as survivors found darkness, triggering memories of nights spent listening to family members' labored breathing or the sounds of death carts rolling through empty streets. Many developed chronic insomnia, preferring the relative safety of daylight to the vulnerable state of sleep. Even laughter became complicated. Survivors often felt guilty about experiencing joy while surrounded by reminders of so much loss. When happiness did break through, it was frequently followed by crushing waves of grief or anxiety. The simple human pleasure of finding something funny became psychologically complex in ways that affected social interactions for years. As we'll continue to explore, these psychological scars shaped not just individual survivors, but entire generations. The children of plague survivors inherited trauma they hadn't directly experienced, growing up in families where anxiety and loss colored every decision. The Black Death's impact extended far beyond its immediate victims, creating ripple effects that would influence European culture, politics, and social structures for centuries to come. The plague didn't just change who lived and who died. It fundamentally altered what it meant to be alive, to form relationships, to hope for the future. For survivors, every day was both a victory over death and a reminder of how easily that victory could be reversed. The isolation ate at survivors from the inside out, a slow poison that worked its way through communities like a secondary infection. Picture this. You've made it through the worst of the plague, your family somehow intact, your home still standing. But when you step outside, the world feels hollow. Empty windows stare back at you like dead eyes. The baker's shop sits abandoned. Flour still dusting the counters where it was left mid-loaf when death came calling. This wasn't the comfortable solitude of choosing to be alone. This was the crushing weight of being one of the few left behind in a world designed for many more. Survivors found themselves walking through neighborhoods that had become graveyards with roofs, past houses where entire families had simply vanished into the earth. The silence was perhaps the most unnerving aspect. Medieval towns had been noisy places, filled with the constant chatter of daily commerce, children playing in streets, animals bleating and clucking in yards. The plague replaced this symphony of life with an oppressive quiet, broken only by the occasional creak of an abandoned shutter, or the scurrying of rats through empty granaries. Survivors developed an intimate relationship with that silence. They learned to read its nuances, to distinguish between the quiet of midday rest and the quiet of death. Some began talking to themselves just to fill the void, carrying on conversations with imagined companions, or speaking aloud to deceased family members as they went about their daily routines. The practical challenges of survival in a depopulated world were staggering. Tasks that had once been shared among many now fell to precious few. A survivor might find themselves simultaneously trying to tend crops, maintain livestock, preserve food, and manage household repairs that would have previously been divided among neighbors or hired help. Women who had never handled money suddenly found themselves managing estates. Children barely out of infancy had to learn skills their parents had intended to teach them over years. The elderly, traditionally cared for by younger generations, often faced abandonment not through cruelty, but through simple absence of the living. The breakdown of specialization that had defined medieval society created surreal situations. A former priest might find himself attempting blacksmithing to repair essential tools. A noble lady could be seen hauling water from wells or slaughtering chickens for dinner. Social roles that had seemed fixed for centuries dissolved overnight when there simply weren't enough people left to maintain them. Bartering replaced currency in many areas because traditional economic systems had collapsed along with the people who operated them. A survivor might trade a silver cup for a sack of grain, not because the grain was more valuable, but because it would keep them alive another week, while the cup offered only memories of better times. The psychological burden of inheriting the possessions of the dead created its own form of trauma. Survivors found themselves surrounded by objects that carried emotional weight far beyond their practical value. Every pot, every piece of clothing, every tool had belonged to someone who was gone. Using these items felt like grave robbing, but necessity demanded it. Some survivors couldn't bear to touch the belongings of the deceased. They would let perfectly good furniture rot in abandoned houses rather than bring it into their own homes. Others became compulsive collectors, hoarding items from the dead as if accumulating enough possessions could somehow fill the human void left behind. The seasonal cycles that had once brought comfort now carried ominous weight. Spring no longer meant renewal when there weren't enough hands to plant crops. Summer heat became associated with the accelerated decay of bodies rather than ripening harvests. Autumn brought dread about surviving winter with insufficient stores. Winter itself stretched endlessly when shared around fires that warmed too few people. Survivors often found themselves responsible for maintaining traditions they barely understood. A young woman might inherit the role of village healer, with only fragments of knowledge gleaned from watching her grandmother work. A teenage boy could become the keeper of local history, trying to remember stories and customs that were dying with their tellers. The absence of witnesses made even small accomplishments feel meaningless. What was the point of preparing an elaborate meal when no one was there to appreciate it? Why maintain a beautiful garden when no one would see it bloom? The very human need for recognition and shared experience went unfulfilled for months or years at a time. Religious observances became particularly challenging for isolated survivors. Many rituals required community participation or at least an audience. Singing hymns alone felt hollow. Observing feast days in solitude turned celebration into mourning. Some survivors abandoned religious practices entirely, while others became obsessively devout, as if perfect piety performed in isolation could somehow compensate for the missing congregation. The cycles of grief became distorted when there was no one to share them with. Survivors mourned alone, without the comfort of others who understood their loss. They progressed through denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance without witnesses to validate their emotions or offer support. This isolation often trapped people in particular stages of grief for extended periods. Some survivors began creating imaginary companions or speaking to portraits of the dead as if they were still alive. These weren't signs of madness, but desperate attempts to maintain human connection in its absence. They would set places at table for deceased family members, or continue conversations interrupted by death weeks or months earlier. The preservation of skills became a race against time and memory. Survivors realized they were often the last people alive who knew how to perform certain tasks. A miller might be the only person left who understood how to maintain the grain processing equipment. A seamstress could be the sole keeper of particular weaving techniques. This knowledge died with them if they couldn't find someone to teach. Writing became crucial for many survivors, not as artistic expression, but as practical necessity. They documented everything from recipes to crop rotation schedules to the locations of buried supplies. These weren't chronicles of great events, but desperate attempts to preserve basic survival information for an uncertain future. The relationship between survivors and their physical environment grew intensely personal. Every landmark carried memories of people who were no longer there to share them. The oak tree where children had played became a monument to lost innocence. The bridge where couples had met for secret conversations echoed with absent voices. The very geography became a map of grief. Some survivors found they couldn't bear to remain in places that held too many memories. They abandoned perfectly functional homes and farms to start over elsewhere, carrying only what they could physically manage. These internal refugees wandered from settlement to settlement, looking for communities where their ghosts couldn't follow. Others became fiercely protective of familiar spaces, refusing to leave even when practical considerations suggested relocation. They maintained empty houses as if their missing occupants might return, keeping beds made and meals prepared for people who would never again cross those thresholds. The absence of children created its own form of existential crisis. In a world where child mortality had always been high, the plague took even this cruel normalcy and made it worse. Survivors found themselves in communities where playgrounds stood empty, where schools had no students, where the sound of children's laughter had simply vanished from daily life. For those survivors who were parents to children who had died, the silence was particularly devastating. They would catch themselves calling out names that would never be answered, preparing portions of food for children who would never eat again, or listening for voices that existed only in memory. The few surviving children faced their own unique trauma. They grew up in a world designed for many more people, playing in empty houses, exploring abandoned buildings, surrounded by evidence that life had once been fuller and richer. These children often developed precocious independence, learning to fend for themselves in ways their parents never intended. Some child survivors became obsessed with collecting objects from the dead, creating elaborate shrines or museums in their homes. Others retreated into fantasy worlds, populating their imagination with friends to replace the playmates they'd lost. Many displayed behaviors that would now be recognized as symptoms of complex trauma, but were then simply accepted as the new normal. The seasonal festivals and celebrations that had once marked time and brought communities together became sources of pain for survivors. How do you celebrate harvest when most of the harvesters are dead? How do you mark religious holidays when the congregation has been reduced to a handful of traumatized individuals? How do you maintain traditions when there aren't enough people left to carry them forward? Some survivors attempted to maintain these observances alone, going through the motions of community celebrations in solitude. They would prepare feast meals for themselves, light bonfires that no one else would see, or perform dances that had once involved dozens of participants. These solitary celebrations were both heartbreaking and necessary, attempts to maintain human culture in the face of devastating loss. The breakdown of normal social hierarchies created unexpected freedoms alongside the trauma. Survivors found themselves able to cross class boundaries that had previously been insurmountable. A peasant woman might find herself living in a manor house simply because everyone else who had a claim to it was dead. A servant could become a landowner through inheritance from masters who had no surviving family. But these opportunities came wrapped in guilt and confusion. How do you enjoy privileges that came to you through others' suffering? How do you take pride in achievements that were only possible because better qualified people had died? The social mobility that the plague created was tainted by the circumstances that made it possible. The absence of authority figures left many survivors adrift without guidance or structure. In communities where the lord, the priest, and the mayor had all perished, who made decisions about resource allocation or dispute resolution? Who determined when it was safe to replant fields or reopen trade routes? The vacuum of leadership often went unfilled for months or years. Some survivors rose to these challenges, discovering leadership abilities they never knew they possessed. Others retreated from responsibility, overwhelmed by the scope of decisions they were unprepared to make. Still others made choices that seemed reasonable at the time, but had devastating long-term consequences for their community's survival and recovery. As we continue to explore this dark chapter of human history, we'll delve deeper into how these isolated, traumatized survivors eventually began the slow, painful process of rebuilding not just their communities, but their very understanding of what it meant to be human in a world that had shown them how quickly civilization itself could crumble. The madness crept in slowly, like water seeping through cracks in a foundation. You didn't notice it at first because everyone was a little broken. Everyone was walking around with that hollow look in their eyes. But as months turned to years, the psychological damage began manifesting in ways that made the physical horrors of the plague seem almost merciful. Take the phenomenon chroniclers began calling phantom conversations. Survivors would be found in animated discussions with empty chairs, arguing with deceased spouses about household decisions, or asking dead children to help with chores. This wasn't occasional absent-mindedness. These conversations could go on for hours, complete with pauses for imagined responses and emotional reactions to words never spoken. The truly unsettling part was how normal this became. Other survivors would walk past these one-sided dialogues without comment, perhaps because they understood the desperate need for human interaction, or perhaps because they were having similar conversations in private. The line between coping mechanism and mental breakdown became impossible to draw. Sleep, when it came at all, brought no relief. Survivors developed what we might recognize today as severe sleep disorders, but in the 14th century, they were simply accepted as part of the new reality. Some people stopped sleeping at night entirely, convinced that darkness brought death. They would doze fitfully during daylight hours, always keeping one eye open for danger that might not even exist. Others became obsessed with cleaning rituals that bordered on self-harm. They would scrub their hands until they bled, wash their clothes daily with harsh lye that burned their skin, or spend hours each day scouring their homes with vinegar and salt. The compulsion to clean became so intense that some survivors wore their fingers to the bone trying to scrub away contamination that existed only in their minds. Food became another battleground for psychological survival. Some survivors hoarded obsessively, hiding caches of grain in walls, burying dried meat in secret locations, or keeping emergency stores they never touched, even when facing starvation. The fear of future scarcity was so overwhelming that they preferred to go hungry rather than consume their precious reserves. Others developed the opposite response. Unable to eat anything that hadn't been prepared in elaborate rituals, they would boil water multiple times, bless every ingredient with prayers or incantations, and refuse to consume food that hadn't been purified according to their personal systems of protection. Meals that had once taken minutes to prepare now consumed hours of anxious preparation. The relationship between survivors and their own bodies became deeply troubled. Having watched the plague transform healthy people into rotting corpses within days, many survivors became hypervigilant about every physical sensation. A slight headache could trigger panic attacks. A minor cut might send someone into hysterics about blood poisoning. The normal aches and pains of daily life became potential death sentences, requiring constant monitoring and interpretation. Some survivors began mutilating themselves in attempts to prevent infection. They would deliberately create wounds to let out bad blood, burn their skin with hot irons to purify it, or consume toxic substances they believed would make them too poisonous for disease to touch. These practices often caused more harm than the plague itself, but desperate people clung to any action that felt like control. The absence of reliable authority figures led to the rise of self-appointed prophets and healers who preyed on survivors' desperation. These individuals claimed special knowledge about preventing future outbreaks, often requiring followers to perform increasingly extreme acts of devotion or self-punishment. Without educated clergy or experienced physicians to provide guidance, survivors were vulnerable to anyone who spoke with confidence about the inexplicable. Memory itself became unreliable under such extreme stress. Survivors would forget the names of deceased family members, conflate different people who had died, or create entirely false memories of events that never occurred. The mind's attempts to process overwhelming trauma sometimes involved rewriting history in ways that made the unbearable slightly more bearable. Some survivors became convinced that they themselves had died, and were living as ghosts or spirits. They would test this belief by deliberately exposing themselves to danger, reasoning that if they were already dead, nothing could harm them further. Others became obsessed with proving they were still alive, pinching themselves constantly, staring at their reflections for hours, or seeking pain as confirmation of their continued existence. The concept of time became fluid for many survivors. Without the normal rhythms of community life to provide structure, days blended together into an endless grey expanse. Some survivors lost track of seasons, celebrating Christmas in summer or planting crops in winter. Others became obsessed with marking time, creating elaborate calendars and counting systems to impose order on chaos. Language itself began breaking down among isolated survivors. People who went months without meaningful conversation would find their speech patterns changing, their vocabulary shrinking, their ability to express complex thoughts deteriorating. Some began speaking in the voices of deceased relatives, unconsciously mimicking speech patterns of people they missed desperately. The few surviving children faced their own unique psychological challenges. Growing up in a world where death was random and constant, they developed coping mechanisms that would have been considered pathological in normal times. Some became obsessed with death imagery, drawing pictures of skeletons, playing games that involve pretending to die, or collecting bones and other morbid objects. Other children went to the opposite extreme, retreating into elaborate fantasy worlds where death didn't exist. They would insist that missing family members were simply away on long journeys, create imaginary friends to replace lost playmates, or refuse to acknowledge the reality of their changed circumstances. This denial could persist for years, creating adults who never fully processed their childhood trauma. The plague also created a generation of children who had learned to survive by becoming emotionally numb. They could look at corpses without flinching, discuss death with casual indifference, and make practical decisions about survival without being hampered by normal emotional responses. This emotional blunting helped them survive, but often made it impossible for them to form meaningful relationships later in life. Physical intimacy became complicated for plague survivors in ways that extended far beyond fear of contagion. The association between human contact and death was so strong that many survivors found themselves unable to touch or be touched without experiencing panic. Marriage beds became battlegrounds between human need for connection and terror of what that connection might bring. Some couples who survived together found their relationships fundamentally altered by shared trauma. They might become obsessively codependent, unable to be apart for even short periods, or they might grow distant despite their physical proximity, each lost in private worlds of grief and fear. The shared experience of horror sometimes bonded survivors together and sometimes drove them apart in equal measure. The burden of being the sole keeper of family history weighed heavily on many survivors. They felt responsible for preserving the memories of deceased relatives, maintaining family traditions, and passing on stories to future generations. But with no one to share these memories with, the task became overwhelming. Some survivors wrote obsessively, creating detailed chronicles of their lost families. Others gave up entirely, allowing entire bloodlines to vanish from human memory. Weather patterns that coincided with plague outbreaks became permanent triggers for anxiety among survivors. The combination of heat and humidity that had accompanied the worst death tolls could send entire communities into panic years later. Survivors would abandon their homes at the first sign of what they perceived as plague weather, fleeing to higher ground or cooler climates regardless of practical considerations. The sight of ships arriving at ports could trigger mass hysteria among coastal survivors who remembered how the disease had first arrived. Some communities banned all maritime trade for years, preferring economic hardship to the risk of imported infection. Others became obsessed with monitoring every vessel that approached their shores, subjecting crews to elaborate quarantine procedures based more on superstition than medical knowledge. Animals associated with the plague years developed almost supernatural significance for survivors. Rats, obviously, became objects of intense hatred and fear, but the psychological response often extended to other creatures as well. Some survivors couldn't bear to see birds, associating them with the carrion crows that had fed on corpses. Others developed phobias about dogs or cats, remembering how domestic animals had sometimes been the first to show signs of illness in infected households. The sound of bells, once used to mark religious observances and community gatherings, became associated with death announcements and funeral processions. Many survivors reported physical reactions to bell sounds years after the plague had ended, experiencing nausea, dizziness, or panic attacks whenever they heard the familiar chimes that had once provided comfort and structure to daily life. Even success and prosperity became psychologically complicated for plague survivors. Those who inherited property or achieved social advancement through the deaths of others often struggled with survivors' guilt that made it impossible to enjoy their improved circumstances. They might give away valuable possessions, refuse to live in inherited homes, or sabotage their own success because they felt unworthy of benefits that came through such tragic circumstances. The concept of planning for the future became almost impossible for many survivors. Why save money for old age when you might die tomorrow? Why train an apprentice when they might not survive to use their skills? Why plant trees that would take decades to mature when the world might end before they bore fruit? This inability to invest in long-term projects had profound economic and cultural implications that persisted for generations. Some survivors developed elaborate systems of superstition and ritual that governed every aspect of their daily lives. They would only eat certain foods on specific days, wear particular colors during certain seasons, or perform complex ceremonies before undertaking any significant activity. These rituals provided a sense of control and predictability in a world that had demonstrated its fundamental randomness and cruelty. The psychological impact of surviving multiple plague waves was particularly devastating. Those who lived through repeated outbreaks often developed a fatalistic worldview that made normal human relationships impossible. They might refuse to form new friendships, avoid emotional attachments, or maintain constant emotional distance from everyone around them as protection against future loss. As we delve deeper into this exploration of survival's hidden costs, we'll examine how these individual psychological wounds combined to create lasting changes in European culture, religion, and social structure. The Black Death didn't just kill bodies, it fundamentally altered the human psyche in ways that would influence art, literature, philosophy, and politics for centuries to come. The plague survivors weren't just rebuilding their physical world, they were reconstructing their understanding of what it meant to be human in a universe that had revealed itself to be far more fragile and hostile than anyone had previously imagined. The breaking point wasn't dramatic. There was no moment of sudden collapse, no theatrical breakdown that marked the transition from functioning survivor to something else entirely. Instead, it was like watching a rope fray, one thread at a time, until what had once held everything together simply wasn't there anymore. You'd see it first in the small things. A woman who had been methodically tending her garden would suddenly stop mid-row, leaving tools scattered in the dirt, and never return to finish planting. A man who had maintained his workshop with obsessive precision would begin leaving projects half-completed, hammers lying where they fell, wood shavings accumulating in corners like snow. The survivors who had seemed strongest, who had taken charge during the worst of the crisis, often cracked without warning. The baker who had managed to keep bread on tables when others had given up would be found one morning, sitting in his empty shop, staring at flour-dusted hands that refused to knead another loaf. The midwife who had delivered babies throughout the plague years would wake up one day unable to remember why bringing new life into such a world had ever seemed important. These weren't moments of madness in the theatrical sense. They were quiet surrenders, internal collapses that happened behind eyes that had seen too much. The survivors themselves often couldn't explain what had changed. They would describe feeling as if they were watching their own lives from a great distance, performing actions that no longer carried meaning or purpose. Sleep became the enemy for many, not because of nightmares, though those continued, but because unconsciousness felt too much like death. Some survivors would fight sleep for days at a time, propping their eyes open with their fingers, pacing endless circles around their homes, convinced that closing their eyes might mean never opening them again. When exhaustion finally claimed them, they would sleep for days, sometimes weeks, awakening more tired than when they had collapsed. Others developed the opposite relationship with sleep, using it as an escape from waking reality that had become unbearable. They would sleep 18 or 20 hours a day, rising only to perform the most basic functions of survival before retreating back into unconsciousness. Their dreams became more real than their waking lives, populated by deceased loved ones and imagined worlds where the plague had never happened. The concept of home transformed into something simultaneously precious and terrifying. Survivors might spend days scrubbing and cleaning their living spaces, trying to create perfect sanctuaries against chaos, only to flee these same spaces in panic when the walls began to feel like tomb chambers. They would sleep in gardens, abandoned buildings, or even in the open air, rather than remain in rooms that held too many memories or felt too much like preparation for burial. Some survivors began constructing elaborate fortifications around their homes, not against human enemies, but against the invisible forces they believed still threatened them. They would block windows with furniture, seal cracks with mud and straw, and create complex entry rituals that had to be performed before anyone could cross their thresholds. These preparations could consume entire days, leaving no time for productive work or social interaction. The relationship with possessions became equally complex. Objects that had belonged to the dead carried supernatural weight, as if they retained some essence of their former owners. A survivor might be unable to use a deceased spouse's cup, not out of sentiment but from genuine terror that drinking from it might somehow invite death back into their home. Tools, clothing, even furniture became charged with emotional significance that made normal life impossible. Conversely, some survivors became unable to form attachments to any material possessions, living with the bare minimum required for survival because investing in comfort or beauty felt like tempting fate. They would use items until they broke, then discard them without replacement, gradually reducing their material world to nothing but the most essential elements needed to maintain biological existence. The calendar itself became a source of torment. Dates that marked the deaths of family members, the arrival of the plague in their community, or particularly traumatic events, would trigger weeks of anticipatory dread followed by days of complete incapacitation. Some survivors lost track of time entirely, unable to distinguish between past trauma and present reality, living in a perpetual state where the plague was always just beginning or just ending, but never truly gone. Religious faith, for those who retained any, took on obsessive characteristics that bore little resemblance to traditional piety. Survivors might pray for hours without ceasing, repeating the same phrases until their voices gave out, convinced that any pause in their devotions would invite divine punishment. Others developed elaborate theological explanations for their survival that required constant mental maintenance, complex belief systems that had to be reinforced through ritualistic behavior performed multiple times daily. The few children who survived faced their own unique psychological landscape. Growing up in communities where most adults were traumatized created a generation that learned to read emotional states with supernatural accuracy. These children could sense an adult's mental state from across a room, adjusting their behavior to avoid triggering breakdowns or violent episodes they had learned to anticipate. Many of these surviving children took on adult responsibilities, not because they were asked to, but because they recognized that the adults around them were no longer capable of reliable decision-making. They would manage household resources, make decisions about food allocation, and even provide emotional support to adults who had become dependent on them for basic functioning. The marketplace, once the beating heart of community life, became a stage for elaborate psychological theatre. Survivors would engage in transactions that made no economic sense, trading valuable items for worthless trinkets or refusing to accept payment for goods and services. The normal rules of commerce broke down when neither buyer nor seller could reliably assess the value of anything in a world where everything could disappear without warning. Some survivors developed compulsive trading behaviors, constantly exchanging possessions as if movement of goods could somehow restore the flow of normal life. They would acquire objects they didn't need, trade them for different objects they didn't want, and repeat the process endlessly. This activity provided the illusion of purposeful behavior while avoiding the emotional investment that real productivity would require. Others became unable to part with anything, accumulating possessions not out of greed, but from an inability to make decisions about value or necessity. Their homes would fill with random objects gathered from abandoned buildings, gifts from other survivors, or items traded in moments of confusion. They lived in increasingly crowded spaces, surrounded by things that provided no comfort, but which they couldn't bear to discard. The breakdown of normal social hierarchies created identity crises that persisted for decades. A former peasant who had inherited a noble estate might continue living like a servant in his own manner, unable to psychologically adjust to his changed circumstances. A merchant's widow who had become wealthy through inheritance might give away her possessions to anyone who asked, unable to reconcile her new status with her internal sense of worthlessness. These identity confusions were compounded by the absence of social mirrors. In normal times, other people's reactions help us understand who we are and how we fit into the world. But when most of those other people were gone, survivors lost the external validation that helps maintain a stable sense of self. They might forget their own names, ages, or personal histories, creating new identities that bore little resemblance to who they had been before the plague. Language began to break down in communities where survivors rarely spoke to each other. Words lost their meaning when there was no one to share them with. Some survivors developed private vocabularies, creating new terms for experiences that had no existing names, or using familiar words in ways that made sense only to them. Communication became increasingly difficult, even when survivors did encounter each other. The few surviving clergy faced particular psychological challenges as they struggled to maintain faith traditions that seemed to have been abandoned by the divine. Some became obsessed with performing religious rituals perfectly, convinced that any deviation from proper form had caused or would cause future catastrophes. They would spend hours ensuring that every word of every prayer was pronounced exactly correctly, that every gesture was performed with precise accuracy. Others abandoned formal religion entirely, but developed personal spiritual practices that incorporated elements of folk magic, superstition, and invented mythology. They created new pantheons of protective spirits, developed elaborate ceremonies for appeasing forces they believed controlled health and death, or convinced themselves that they had been chosen for special prophetic missions that required them to interpret signs and omens in everything around them. The concept of healing became problematic when survivors couldn't distinguish between physical and psychological symptoms. A headache might be treated with the same desperate intensity as a plague boil. Minor injuries could trigger complete emotional breakdowns. Conversely, serious medical problems might be ignored entirely if they didn't fit into a survivor's system of understanding about what constituted a real threat. Some survivors became obsessed with their own mortality, checking their bodies multiple times daily for signs of illness, monitoring their breathing, pulse, and temperature with ritualistic precision. Others developed the opposite response, becoming recklessly indifferent to physical danger, walking through obviously unsafe areas, consuming questionable food, or ignoring injuries that required treatment. The seasonal cycles that had once provided structure and meaning to agricultural communities became sources of profound anxiety. Spring planting required optimism about the future that many survivors couldn't muster. Summer brought memories of the heat that had accompanied the worst death tolls. Autumn harvests felt pointless when there might not be anyone alive to consume the crops. Winter's approach triggered hoarding behaviors and preparation rituals that went far beyond practical necessity. Time itself moved differently for plague survivors. Minutes could feel like hours when filled with hypervigilant monitoring for signs of danger. Days could pass like minutes when survivors lost themselves in repetitive activities or dissociative states. The normal human ability to gauge the passage of time became unreliable, making it difficult to perform even simple tasks that required temporal coordination. Memory became selectively functional, with survivors often able to recall traumatic events in excruciating detail while forgetting basic information about their own lives. They might remember exactly how a particular corpse had looked while being unable to recall what they had eaten the previous day. This selective memory loss made it difficult to learn from experience or make plans based on past events. The absence of witnesses to their daily struggles meant that survivors' pain went unacknowledged and unvalidated. Without others to confirm that their experiences were real and their responses were reasonable, many began to doubt their own perceptions and reactions. This self-doubt compounded their isolation and made it even more difficult to trust their own judgment about basic survival decisions. Some survivors began creating elaborate documentation of their daily activities, writing detailed accounts of their thoughts, feelings, and actions as a way of proving to themselves that their experiences were real. These journals often became obsessive projects that consumed hours each day, filled with minutiae that would have seemed insignificant to outside observers, but felt essential to the writer's sense of existing in reality. Others developed the opposite response, becoming unable to maintain any record of their experiences, living in a perpetual present, where each day existed in isolation from those that came before or might come after. They would wake each morning with no clear memory of previous days, repeating the same activities and conversations as if encountering them for the first time. The psychological wounds inflicted by surviving the Black Death created a generation of people who were fundamentally different from any who had come before. They had seen civilization collapse and partially rebuild itself, had witnessed the failure of every institution they had been taught to trust, and had learned that survival itself could be a form of suffering that lasted far longer than death. These survivors would become the foundation upon which European society reconstructed itself, but they carried within themselves the seeds of profound changes that would reshape everything from art and literature to politics and religion. The world they rebuilt would reflect not just their practical needs but their psychological scars, creating new forms of human organization designed by people who had learned that everything they thought they knew about life could disappear without warning. As we continue to explore the long-term consequences of plague survival, we'll see how these individual psychological wounds combined to create cultural changes that persisted for centuries, influencing everything from the development of modern medicine to the Protestant Reformation to the eventual rise of humanism and scientific thinking that would define the Renaissance and beyond. The work never stopped, and that might have been the cruelest irony of all. You survived the Black Death only to discover that survival meant becoming responsible for everything the dead had left behind. Every task, every responsibility, every small detail of keeping a community functional now fell to fewer and fewer shoulders. Picture this. You're one of maybe 20 people left in a town that once housed 300. The mill still needs grain, but there's no miller. The fields still need tending, but most of the farmers are buried beneath them. The animals still need feeding, but their owners died months ago. And somehow, impossibly, you're expected to figure out how to do all of it. The learning curve was brutal and unforgiving. A teenage girl who had never touched a plow suddenly found herself responsible for feeding what remained of her community. A blacksmith's apprentice became the sole keeper of metalworking knowledge he'd barely begun to understand. Children who should have been playing were instead trying to master crafts that typically took decades to learn, meant death, not just for yourself but for everyone depending. The pressure was suffocating because failure on you There was no room for error, no time for practice, no luxury of gradual skill development. You either figured out how to mill grain correctly on your first attempt, or your community starved. You either learned to preserve meat properly immediately, or everyone died of food poisoning. Women found themselves thrust into roles that medieval society had never prepared them for. They became landlords, managing estates they'd never been taught to understand. They negotiated trade agreements with knowledge gleaned from overhearing their husbands' conversations. They made legal decisions based on half-remembered fragments of laws they'd never been allowed to study. The physical demands alone were staggering. Tasks that had once been shared among dozens of people now fell to handfuls of survivors. A single person might find themselves responsible for tending livestock, maintaining buildings, processing food, and managing trade relationships that had previously required entire families or guilds to handle. Sleep became a luxury that many survivors simply couldn't afford. There were literally not enough hours in the day to accomplish everything that needed doing. People would work until they collapsed from exhaustion, sleep for a few hours, then wake to face the same overwhelming list of essential tasks. The concept of rest, of leisure, of having time for personal reflection or enjoyment simply ceased to exist. The technical knowledge that died with the plague victims created gaps that survivors struggled desperately to fill. How do you operate a watermill when the miller took his knowledge to the grave? How do you maintain complex irrigation systems when the engineers who built them are dead? How do you practice medicine when the physicians and their apprentices are all buried in mass graves? Some survivors became obsessive about documenting everything they learned, creating detailed manuals and guides for tasks they were still figuring out themselves. They wrote down every successful technique, every failed experiment, every hard-won piece of practical wisdom, terrified that if they died, the knowledge would die with them and leave the next generation even more helpless. Others hoarded their newfound expertise, becoming protective of skills that gave them value and security in an uncertain world. A survivor who learned to repair water wheels might refuse to teach others, knowing that their unique knowledge made them indispensable. This created communities where critical skills were concentrated in single individuals whose death or incapacity could doom everyone. The seasonal pressures were particularly intense because agricultural timing doesn't wait for human recovery. Crops had to be planted during specific windows, regardless of whether survivors felt ready. Harvests couldn't be delayed because people were still learning how to use the tools. Animals needed care according to their biological rhythms, not human emotional readiness. Many survivors found themselves working land they'd inherited from dead relatives, trying to remember half-understood conversations about crop rotation, soil management, and weather prediction. They planted seeds in the wrong seasons, harvested crops at the wrong times, and watched years of potential food production fail because they lacked knowledge that had seemed so mundane before the plague. The guilds and apprenticeship systems that had traditionally transmitted knowledge across generations collapsed entirely. A master craftsman who had spent decades learning his trade would die, taking with him not just his own expertise, but his responsibility for training the next generation. Entire professions vanished overnight when their practitioners succumbed to disease. Survivors often found themselves attempting to reverse engineer complex processes from examining finished products. They would study completed metalwork to try to understand forging techniques or dissect abandoned buildings to figure out construction methods. This archaeological approach to learning was inefficient and dangerous, but it was often the only option available. The quality of goods and services declined precipitously as survivors struggled with skills they hadn't had time to master properly. Bread might be burned or undercooked because new bakers hadn't learned to judge oven temperatures correctly. Buildings might collapse because amateur builders didn't understand structural engineering. Tools might break immediately because replacement blacksmiths lacked the experience to create durable metalwork. This decline in quality created cascading problems throughout communities. When your tools break more frequently, you spend more time repairing them and less time being productive. When your buildings are poorly constructed, you waste resources on constant maintenance. When your food is improperly prepared, people get sick, reducing the already limited workforce even further. The psychological burden of being responsible for everyone's survival was crushing. Imagine knowing that if you made a mistake while preserving the autumn harvest, people would starve during winter. Imagine understanding that if you couldn't figure out how to repair the village's water source, everyone would die of thirst. The weight of that responsibility drove many survivors to nervous breakdowns. Some developed paralysis from the fear of making critical mistakes. They would spend hours agonizing over decisions that needed to be made quickly, second-guessing themselves until opportunities passed and problems became worse. The luxury of being wrong, of learning from mistakes without fatal consequences, had disappeared along with the population that could absorb such errors. Others swung to the opposite extreme, making rapid decisions without sufficient thought because the pressure to act was so intense. They would implement solutions that seemed reasonable in the moment, but created long-term problems they lacked the experience to anticipate. These hasty choices often made survival even more difficult for future generations. The absence of specialized roles meant that everyone had to become generalists. But generalization meant that nothing was done with the expertise it required. A community might have adequate food, shelter, and tools, but all of inferior quality because no one had the time or knowledge to excel in any particular area. Trade relationships that had taken generations to establish crumbled when key intermediaries died. Survivors might know that their community needed salt or iron, but have no idea how to contact suppliers or negotiate fair prices. They would accept unfavorable deals out of desperation, gradually impoverishing their communities through inexperience. The legal knowledge that governed property rights, contracts, and dispute resolution died with the educated elites who had administered it. Survivors found themselves in situations where they knew something was wrong, but had no idea how to address it through proper channels. This legal vacuum led to conflicts that might have been easily resolved in normal times, but became sources of lasting division in depleted communities. Record-keeping, essential for managing resources and planning for the future, became nearly impossible when most literate people had died. Survivors who could barely read found themselves trying to maintain complex inventories, track debts and credits, and document agreements they didn't fully understand. Many communities lost track of their own assets and obligations, creating confusion that persisted for decades. The medical knowledge that might have helped survivors recover from their trauma and maintain their health vanished along with the physicians who possessed it. People suffered from treatable conditions that became chronic or fatal simply because no one knew how to provide proper care. Basic hygiene practices that might have prevented secondary infections were forgotten when the people who understood them died. Children growing up in this environment received education that was fragmentary at best. The schools were closed, the teachers were dead, and the surviving adults were too busy with immediate survival needs to provide proper instruction. Entire generations grew up illiterate, innumerate, and lacking the cultural knowledge that had been passed down for centuries. The crafts and arts that had enriched medieval life began disappearing as communities focused solely on basic survival. There was no time for music, storytelling, or decorative arts, when every moment had to be devoted to staying alive. The cultural wealth that had made communities vibrant and distinct gradually eroded, leaving behind societies focused only on the most fundamental needs. Religious observances became simplified or abandoned entirely because the clergy who had maintained complex liturgical traditions were gone. Survivors might remember fragments of prayers or rituals, but the deeper theological knowledge and ceremonial practices that had given meaning to religious life disappeared along with their keepers. The technological innovations that had been slowly improving medieval life stagnated or regressed as the knowledge needed to maintain and develop them was lost. Watermills fell into disrepair, roads became impassable, and building techniques became cruder as survivors focused on quick fixes rather than quality construction. Even the most basic social skills atrophied when communities became too small to maintain normal interpersonal relationships. Children grew up without learning how to navigate complex social hierarchies, resolve conflicts through established customs, or participate in the elaborate etiquette that had governed medieval social interaction. The burden of being the sole repository of family history and traditions weighed heavily on many survivors. They felt responsible for preserving the memories, stories, and customs of entire lineages, but lacked the time or energy to properly maintain these cultural treasures. Many family traditions simply vanished when their last keeper became too overwhelmed to pass them on. The isolation that came with being one of the few survivors meant that there was no one to validate your efforts or provide encouragement during the inevitable failures and setbacks. You might work for months to master a critical skill, only to have your first major attempt fail spectacularly, with no experienced mentor to explain what went wrong or how to improve. The constant pressure created a generation of people who never learned to relax, to enjoy leisure, or to pursue activities that weren't directly related to survival. Even decades after the plague had ended, many survivors remained locked in crisis mode, unable to shift from emergency survival thinking to the kind of long-term planning and cultural development that thriving communities require. The skills that survivors did manage to learn were often narrow and specific to their immediate circumstances, lacking the broader understanding that would allow for innovation or adaptation. They might learn exactly how to repair one type of mill wheel, but lack the engineering knowledge to design improvements or adapt the technique to different situations. The absence of competition and peer review meant that survivors often learned techniques incorrectly and passed on flawed knowledge to future generations. Without other practitioners to compare notes with or learn from, mistakes became embedded in local practices and persisted long after better methods might have been available. The physical toll of performing so many different types of work led to injuries and health problems that further reduced communities' already limited human resources. People pushed their bodies beyond reasonable limits because there was no alternative, creating chronic problems that made them less effective over time. The emotional exhaustion of carrying so much responsibility often led to decision fatigue, where survivors became increasingly unable to make good choices as the day progressed. Critical decisions made while mentally depleted often had consequences that lasted far longer than the temporary tiredness that caused them. As we'll continue to explore, this crushing burden of unwanted responsibility created lasting changes in how Europeans thought about work, education, and social organization. The survivors who somehow managed to keep their communities alive through this impossible period would eventually rebuild a world that looked very different from the one that had existed before the plague, shaped by their hard-won understanding of how fragile and precious human knowledge really is. The plague changed more than just who lived and who died. It rewrote the very rules of what it meant to be human, starting with something as fundamental as touch. Before the Black Death, medieval life was intensely physical. People shared beds, bowls, and breathing space without a second thought. Families crowded together in single rooms, strangers brushed shoulders in market squares, and physical contact was woven into every social interaction from greeting neighbors to conducting business. All of that ended when touch became potentially fatal. Imagine trying to comfort a crying child while being terrified that getting too close might kill you both. Picture attempting to care for a sick parent while knowing that every moment of contact increased your chances of joining them in the grave. The most basic human instincts, our drive to nurture and connect through physical presence, became acts of potential suicide. Survivors developed elaborate protocols for human interaction that would have seemed absurd just years earlier. They spoke to each other from distances of several feet, conducted business through intermediaries, and created complex systems of gestures and signals to replace physical contact. A handshake became a death wish. A hug was attempted murder. The psychological impact of this forced isolation from touch was devastating in ways that medieval people had no vocabulary to describe. Humans require physical contact for emotional regulation, stress relief, and basic mental health. When that contact becomes forbidden, the mind begins to deteriorate in subtle but profound ways. Some survivors became so starved for human contact that they would deliberately expose themselves to danger just to experience touch, even if it meant risking infection. Others went to the opposite extreme, developing such intense phobias about physical contact that they couldn't bear to be in the same room as another person, even years after the plague had passed. Children who grew up during this period learned to associate human closeness with death in ways that affected their ability to form relationships for the rest of their lives. They became adults who couldn't properly bond with their own children, who found marriage psychologically impossible, or who lived in a state of constant anxiety whenever they were physically close to others. The rituals around death and burial, which had provided crucial psychological closure for medieval communities, became impossible to maintain safely. Traditional funeral practices required family members and friends to wash and prepare bodies, to hold vigils beside the deceased, to carry coffins and gather closely around graves. The plague made all of these comforting customs potentially lethal. Instead, bodies were disposed of with the efficiency of waste management rather than the reverence of sacred ritual. Mass graves replaced individual burials. Anonymous corpse collectors replaced grieving family members. The spiritual and emotional processes that helped communities process loss were abandoned in favor of purely practical disposal methods that protected the living at the cost of psychological healing. This disruption of death rituals created a form of complicated grief that had no resolution. Survivors never got to say proper goodbyes, never got to perform the ceremonies that would have helped them process their loss, never got to mark the transition from life to death in ways their culture had developed over centuries. They were left with a kind of emotional wound that couldn't heal because it had never been properly acknowledged. The economic implications of untouchability were equally devastating. Medieval commerce relied heavily on personal relationships, physical examination of goods, and face-to-face negotiations that built trust over time. When human interaction became dangerous, entire commercial systems collapsed. A grain merchant couldn't properly assess the quality of wheat without handling it. A cloth buyer couldn't judge fabric without feeling its texture. A livestock trader couldn't evaluate animals without close physical inspection. The sensory evaluation that underpinned medieval trade became impossible when getting close enough to touch anything might mean death. New forms of commerce emerged that prioritized distance over quality assessment. Goods were sold sight unseen. Prices were negotiated through intermediaries, and quality control became impossible. This led to widespread fraud and commercial disputes that further destabilized communities already struggling with massive population loss. The legal system, which had relied on physical presence for testimony, oath-taking, and the symbolic gestures that sealed agreements, had to be completely reimagined. How do you swear an oath when you can't touch the sacred objects that make it binding? How do you identify witnesses when you can't get close enough to see them clearly? How do you enforce contracts when the parties can't meet safely to resolve disputes? Many communities simply abandoned legal processes entirely during plague years, leading to a breakdown in social order that persisted long after the disease had passed. Without functioning courts or enforceable contracts, societies reverted to more primitive forms of justice, based on personal violence or clan loyalty, rather than established law. Marriage ceremonies became logistical nightmares when the bride and groom couldn't safely touch each other, let alone consummate their union. Some couples were married at distances of several yards, shouting their vows across empty spaces while witnesses watched from even further away. Others postponed weddings indefinitely, creating a generation of people who reached adulthood without the social structures, that normally guided them into adult relationships. The training of apprentices, which had been the backbone of medieval skill transmission, became impossible when masters couldn't work closely with their students. Crafts that required hands-on instruction, precise demonstration, and physical correction of technique couldn't be taught when teacher and student had to maintain safe distances from each other. This disruption of apprenticeship systems had consequences that lasted for decades. Entire professions lost their accumulated expertise because the knowledge couldn't be properly transmitted during the plague years. Skills that had been refined over generations were lost forever when the chain of instruction was broken by the impossibility of close contact between teacher and student. Religious practices, which had been central to medieval identity and community cohesion, faced similar disruptions. Communion became impossible when sharing bread and wine might spread infection. Confession couldn't be heard when priest and penitent couldn't safely speak in close quarters. Baptisms, weddings, and last rites all required physical contact or proximity that had become too dangerous to risk. Some communities attempted to maintain religious observances through elaborate modifications that stripped them of their essential meaning. Priests might bless congregation members from across the room using long sticks to sprinkle holy water. Communion bread might be thrown from altars to believers who caught it like scraps thrown to animals. The sacred became absurd, and the absurd became necessary for survival. The breakdown of religious ritual had profound psychological consequences for survivors who had relied on these practices for spiritual comfort and community identity. Without the familiar ceremonies that had marked life's transitions and provided meaning during difficult times, many people felt spiritually adrift, unable to process their experiences through the religious frameworks that had previously sustained them. Physical labor, which had been organized around teams of workers cooperating on shared tasks, had to be completely reorganized when people couldn't work in close proximity. Harvesting crops, constructing buildings, and operating mills all required coordination between multiple people working together in confined spaces. The plague made such cooperation impossible. Individual workers had to develop new techniques for accomplishing tasks that had previously required group effort. Fields that might have been harvested by teams of a dozen people working together had to be managed by isolated individuals working alone. Construction projects that relied on coordinated lifting and placement of heavy materials became impossible when workers couldn't get close enough to each other to coordinate their efforts. This forced individualization of labor was physically exhausting and often dangerous. Tasks that had been safely performed by groups became hazardous when attempted alone. Workers injured themselves trying to accomplish things that should have required multiple people, further reducing the already limited workforce available to struggling communities. The education of children, which had traditionally involved close physical supervision and hands-on guidance, became nearly impossible during plague years. Teachers couldn't get close enough to students to correct their writing, demonstrate techniques, or provide the kind of individual attention that effective learning requires. Many children simply received no formal education at all during this period, creating gaps in knowledge that affected entire generations. Family life was perhaps most cruelly disrupted by the impossibility of safe physical contact. Parents couldn't comfort their children with hugs or kisses when they were frightened. Spouses couldn't provide physical reassurance during times of stress. The basic human behaviors that bond families together and provide emotional security became potentially lethal. Some families developed elaborate systems of non-contact communication, using gestures, facial expressions, and verbal cues to maintain emotional connection while preserving physical distance. Others gradually drifted apart as the absence of touch eroded the bonds that held them together. Children grew up feeling unloved, not because their parents didn't care, but because expressing that care had become too dangerous. The elderly, who were particularly vulnerable to plague infection, often found themselves completely isolated from human contact. Family members who might have provided care and companionship were forced to maintain distances that made meaningful interaction impossible. Many old people died not from plague, but from the despair and neglect that resulted from this enforced isolation. Personal hygiene practices, which had been communal activities in medieval society, had to be completely reimagined when sharing water, soap, or bathing facilities became dangerous. Public bathhouses closed permanently. Families couldn't share washing basins. Even laundry became hazardous when handling clothing that others had worn might spread infection. The result was a general decline in cleanliness that actually increased the risk of disease transmission, creating a vicious cycle where fear of infection led to behaviors that made infection more likely. Communities that had maintained reasonable standards of hygiene for centuries reverted to much more primitive practices that compromised everyone's health. Medical care, which had always relied on physical examination, became guesswork when doctors couldn't safely touch their patients. Physicians developed long probes and instruments that allowed them to examine people from distances, but these tools were crude and often ineffective. Many medical conditions that could have been easily diagnosed through physical examination went unrecognized and untreated. The famous plague doctor costume, with its long beak and full body covering, was designed specifically to allow medical practitioners to approach patients while minimizing physical contact. But these elaborate protective systems also created psychological barriers that made genuine healing relationships impossible. Patients couldn't see their doctors' faces, couldn't receive comforting touch, and often felt more frightened than helped by these bizarre apparitions. The disruption of normal sexual relationships had demographic consequences that lasted for generations. Young adults, who should have been forming families and having children, were either too frightened of physical intimacy or too isolated from potential partners to reproduce normally. Birth rates plummeted not just because of plague deaths, but because of the psychological barriers to intimate relationships that the disease created. Some communities developed elaborate courtship rituals that allowed young people to evaluate potential partners while maintaining safe distances. Others simply abandoned the concept of romantic love entirely, arranging marriages based purely on practical considerations like property transfer or labor needs, without regard for personal compatibility or emotional connection. The few couples who did manage to marry during plague years often found that their relationships were permanently marked by the fear and distance that had characterized their courtship. They remained psychologically separate even when physical danger had passed, unable to develop the intimacy that makes marriages truly functional and emotionally satisfying. Musical and artistic traditions that required group participation gradually disappeared as communities lost the ability to gather safely for cultural activities. Choral singing became impossible when voices couldn't blend from safe distances. Dancing couldn't be performed when partners couldn't touch. Theatrical performances were abandoned when actors couldn't share stages. The loss of these cultural practices had consequences beyond mere entertainment. Music, dance, and theatre had served important social functions in medieval communities, providing ways for people to process emotions, build social bonds, and maintain cultural identity. When these outlets disappeared, communities lost crucial mechanisms for psychological healing and social cohesion. The cumulative effect of all these disruptions was the creation of a society that had forgotten how to be human in the most basic sense. People who had survived the plague found themselves living in communities where normal social interaction was impossible, where the fundamental behaviors that create and maintain human relationships had become forbidden or forgotten. This wasn't just a temporary adjustment that could be reversed when the danger passed. The psychological patterns established during plague years persisted long after infection was no longer a threat. Survivors had learned to associate human closeness with death so strongly that they couldn't simply return to normal behavior when the plague ended. The children who grew up during this period became adults who passed these fearful, isolated behaviors onto their own children, creating generational patterns of emotional distance and social dysfunction that influenced European culture for centuries. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed ways of being human that had developed over thousands of years of social evolution. The rebuilding process that followed the plague had to account for these profound changes in human behavior. New social institutions, new forms of commerce, new religious practices, and new family structures all had to be developed that could function in a world where people had been fundamentally changed by their experience of survival. Recovery wasn't just a matter of replacing the dead and rebuilding the economy. It required reconstructing the very foundations of human society from the ground up, creating new ways of living that could accommodate people who had been psychologically transformed by their encounter with mass death and the impossibility of normal human connection. The plague survivors who eventually rebuilt European civilization weren't the same species of human that had existed before 1347. They were something new, something different, something forever marked by the knowledge that the most basic human behaviors could become instruments of death. Their rebuilt world reflected this change, creating forms of social organization that prioritize safety and distance over intimacy and trust. As we continue to explore the legacy of plague survival, we'll examine how these fundamental changes in human behavior influenced everything from the development of capitalism to the Protestant Reformation, from the rise of nationalism to the eventual emergence of modern individualism. The Black Death didn't just end the medieval world, it created the psychological foundations for the modern world that would eventually replace it. The children born into this plague-scarred world inherited trauma they had never directly experienced, growing up in the shadow of stories they could barely comprehend. Picture a 5-year-old asking their mother why she flinches every time someone coughs, or why daddy won't let them play with the neighbor children, or why grandmama cries when she looks at empty chairs around the dinner table. These plague babies, as they came to be known, developed in an environment where anxiety was the default state, where hypervigilance was considered normal parenting, where the simple act of making friends was treated as a potentially life-threatening decision. Their mothers had learned that loving someone meant accepting they might disappear without warning, and this lesson was passed down in 1,000 subtle ways. The playground dynamics in post-plague communities were unlike anything in human history. Children learned to play games that maintained physical distance, developed elaborate rules about sharing toys, and internalized the belief that other children were potential sources of danger. Tag became impossible. Ring Around the Rosie took on sinister new meanings. Even simple games like hide and seek carried undertones of real loss that made them psychologically unbearable for many families. Schools, when they reopened, had to accommodate children who had been raised by traumatized adults with no reference point for normal childhood development. Teachers found themselves dealing with students who couldn't concentrate because they were constantly listening for signs of illness in their classmates, who hoarded food because they'd learned that scarcity could come without warning, who reacted to minor injuries as if they were plague symptoms. The bedtime stories that these children heard weren't fairy tales about princes and princesses, but accounts of survival, loss, and the unpredictable nature of death. Parents who had lived through the plague couldn't bring themselves to tell comforting lies about happily ever after when they knew firsthand how quickly everything could end. Instead, children fell asleep to stories about being brave when everyone around you was dying, about making difficult choices with incomplete information, about the importance of being prepared for the worst. This early exposure to existential terror created a generation that aged rapidly in emotional terms while remaining stunted in others. 10-year-olds made decisions with the gravity of adults, but 15-year-olds still hadn't learned basic social skills because their parents had been too afraid to let them interact normally with peers. They were simultaneously too mature and completely unprepared for the world they were inheriting. The transition from childhood to adulthood became blurred when traditional coming-of-age rituals had been abandoned during the plague years. Many communities had lost the knowledge of how to properly mark these transitions, and the adults who remained were too psychologically damaged to provide adequate guidance. Young people found themselves drifting into adult responsibilities without clear markers or ceremonies to help them understand what was expected of them. Marriage customs transformed dramatically as communities grappled with the reality that traditional courtship practices had become associated with death and disease. Young people who should have been learning how to form romantic relationships instead learned elaborate protocols for evaluating potential partners from safe distances, for negotiating unions that prioritized survival over love, for creating families based on practical necessity rather than emotional connection. The concept of romantic love itself became problematic in post-plague society. How do you write poetry about eternal devotion when everyone you know has watched eternal devotion end in mass graves? How do you promise to love someone forever when forever had been redefined as potentially ending tomorrow? The very language of romance had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Wedding ceremonies became exercises in managed risk rather than celebrations of joy. Families would spend months planning elaborate safety protocols, determining which relatives could safely attend, designing seating arrangements that maintained proper distances, and creating new rituals that could accommodate the psychological needs of people who had been trained to fear human gathering. The wedding night itself presented unique challenges for couples who had been raised to associate physical intimacy with potential death. Many marriages remained unconsummated for months or years, as newlyweds struggled to overcome the psychological barriers that plague survival had created. Some couples never managed to develop normal, intimate relationships, living together as roommates rather than lovers, because the fear was simply too deeply ingrained. Pregnancy and childbirth took on apocalyptic significance in communities where every new life represented both hope and potential loss. Expectant mothers lived in constant terror that their children might not survive, while simultaneously feeling guilty about bringing new life into a world that had proven itself to be so hostile to human existence. The joy that should have accompanied pregnancy was replaced by anxious monitoring and obsessive preparation for loss. The few midwives who had survived the plague often found themselves providing more psychological support than medical care, helping women work through the complex emotions of creating new life in the aftermath of mass death. These birth attendants became informal counselors, helping families process their fears and develop coping strategies for the unique challenges of post-plague parenting. Child-rearing practices developed along lines that would have seemed pathologically overprotective in earlier times, but made perfect sense to parents who had survived the collapse of everything they had once believed was stable. Children were monitored constantly for signs of illness, isolated from potential sources of infection, and taught from infancy that the world was a dangerous place that required constant vigilance. The lullabies that mothers sang to these children often contained warnings disguised as comfort, gentle melodies that taught lessons about recognizing symptoms, avoiding crowds, and preparing for separation. Traditional nursery rhymes were modified to include practical survival advice, creating a generation that absorbed anxiety about death and disease, along with their earliest learning experiences. Educational priorities shifted dramatically as communities realized that the knowledge that had died with plague victims needed to be preserved and transmitted more effectively. Children were taught practical skills at much younger ages, not because their communities believed in early development, but because there was genuine fear that knowledge might be lost again if it wasn't spread more widely among survivors. The apprenticeship systems that had traditionally governed skill transmission were rebuilt with new emphasis on redundancy and documentation. Multiple children would be trained in essential crafts simultaneously. Detailed written instructions would be created for processes that had previously been passed down orally, and communities developed backup plans for every critical function in case key individuals were lost to future outbreaks. This obsession with preserving knowledge created a generation of children who were simultaneously over-educated in practical skills and under-educated in cultural and emotional development. They could perform complex technical tasks, but struggled with basic social interaction. They understood the mechanics of survival, but had little grasp of what made life worth living beyond mere biological existence. Play itself became a form of preparation for future catastrophes. Children's games evolved to include elements of resource management, risk assessment, and crisis response. Rather than playing house, children played survival camp. Instead of pretending to be knights and princesses, they role-played scenarios involving disease outbreaks, food shortages, and community rebuilding. These games served important psychological functions, allowing children to process the traumatic stories they had absorbed from adults, while developing skills they might actually need if disaster struck again. But they also normalized a level of anxiety and preparedness that would have been considered pathological in pre-plague society. The relationship between children and their grandparents became particularly complex in families where the middle generation had been decimated by plague. Young children might find themselves being raised primarily by elderly survivors who had lived through multiple waves of disease and carried their own deep psychological scars from those experiences. These grandparent caregivers often projected their own fears and traumas onto the children in their care, creating family dynamics where multiple generations were simultaneously protecting each other from dangers that might not exist while failing to address the very real, emotional needs that definitely did exist. Children learned to comfort adults who were still processing their own grief while trying to develop their own identities in an environment of constant anxiety. The absence of peers created unique social challenges for plague generation children. In communities where most children had died, survivors often grew up without age-appropriate companions, learning to socialize primarily with adults or with children much older or younger than themselves. This disrupted normal developmental patterns and created individuals who never fully learned how to relate to people their own age. Some communities attempted to address this by creating artificial peer groups, bringing together children from different towns or regions to provide social interaction opportunities. But these arranged friendships often felt forced and artificial, lacking the organic development that creates genuine childhood bonds. Children learn to go through the motions of friendship without developing the emotional skills that make real relationships possible. The stories that defined childhood experience in post-plague communities were fundamentally different from traditional fairy tales or moral fables. These children grew up on accounts of real survival, tales of ordinary people making extraordinary choices under impossible circumstances, stories that emphasized the importance of practical skills over magical solutions. These narratives shaped a worldview that was simultaneously more realistic and more pessimistic than anything previous generations had experienced. Children learned to expect disaster, to plan for loss, and to value survival skills over emotional fulfillment. They developed a kind of premature wisdom about life's fragility that made them effective survivors but poor candidates for happiness or spontaneous joy. The physical environments where these children grew up bore constant reminders of loss and trauma. They played in houses that had once belonged to larger families, slept in beds where siblings had died, and walked past empty buildings that stood as monuments to the dead. Their entire physical world was haunted by absence in ways that shaped their understanding of what was normal or possible. Some families attempted to shield children from these reminders by moving to new locations or completely renovating their living spaces. But the psychological impact of growing up, surrounded by evidence of mass death, was impossible to escape entirely. Children developed a kind of environmental awareness that made them acutely conscious of signs of abandonment, decay, or loss wherever they went. The seasonal cycles that had once brought childhood joy became associated with memories of plague timing and survival challenges. Spring didn't mean flowers and new life so much as the season when disease might return. Summer brought memories of heat and death rather than freedom from school and outdoor play. Each season carried weight that children absorbed from the adults around them without fully understanding its source. Food relationships became particularly complex, for children who had been raised by adults with hoarding behaviors and anxiety about scarcity. They learned to eat everything on their plates, not because they were hungry, but because waste was associated with potential starvation. They developed complicated relationships with appetite and pleasure that often persisted throughout their lives. The religious education that these children received was fundamentally altered by their parents' crisis of faith. Traditional teachings about divine protection and moral order had been challenged by plague experiences, and adults struggled to pass on beliefs they no longer fully embraced. Children often received religious instruction that was hesitant, conditional, and filled with unspoken doubts. Some families abandoned religious education entirely, unable to reconcile traditional teachings with their lived experience of apparently random suffering. Others doubled down on religious instruction, but in ways that emphasized fear, punishment, and preparation for divine wrath, rather than comfort, love, and spiritual joy. Either approach created children who had complicated relationships with spirituality and moral authority. The concept of future planning became both essential and emotionally fraught for families raising children in post-plague communities. Parents felt compelled to prepare their children for every possible catastrophe, while simultaneously struggling with their own inability to believe in long-term stability. They taught survival skills while battling internal doubt about whether there would be a future for their children to survive into. This created a generation that was simultaneously overprepared for disaster and underprepared for normalcy. They could handle crisis situations with remarkable competence, but struggled with routine decisions and everyday social interaction. They excelled in emergencies but floundered during peaceful times when their crisis management skills weren't needed. The emotional vocabulary that these children developed was shaped by their parents' trauma responses and often lacked words for positive experiences or normal childhood feelings. They learned elaborate terms for different types of grief, fear, and survival strategies, but had limited language for joy, wonder, or carefree happiness. This linguistic limitation shaped their ability to recognize and process positive emotions throughout their lives. Physical affection patterns established during plague years persisted in child-rearing practices even after the immediate danger had passed. Children were raised with limited touching, distant expressions of love, and emotional connections that prioritized safety over intimacy. They learned to interpret love through practical care rather than physical comfort, creating relationship patterns that they would carry into their adult lives and pass on to their own children. The games, songs, stories, and traditions that defined childhood in post-plague communities became the cultural foundation for European society as it rebuilt itself. These children grew up to become the adults who would create the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the early modern world. Their childhood experiences of trauma, survival, and premature responsibility shaped the values, priorities, and social structures of the civilization they eventually built. Understanding how the Black Death affected not just the people who lived through it, but the children they raised helps explain many of the cultural shifts that occurred in late medieval and early modern Europe. The emphasis on individual responsibility, the skepticism toward authority, the focus on practical education, and the complex relationship with mortality that characterized this period all had their roots in the childhood experiences of people who were raised by plague survivors. These children became adults who valued preparation over optimism, who trusted their own judgment over institutional authority, and who understood that stability was always temporary and had to be actively maintained rather than simply assumed. They created a world that reflected their childhood lessons about the importance of being ready for anything and the danger of becoming too comfortable with apparently peaceful times. As we continue to examine the long-term consequences of plague survival, we'll see how these childhood experiences influenced everything from religious reform to scientific revolution, from artistic expression to political organization. The Black Death didn't just change the people who lived through it. It changed the people they raised, and through them, it changed the fundamental character of Western civilization. The children of plague survivors grew up to build a world that was simultaneously more prepared for catastrophe and more suspicious of comfort than anything that had come before. Their legacy is visible in institutions, ideas, and cultural patterns that persist to this day, reminders of how deeply childhood trauma can shape not just individual lives, but entire civilizations. The plague's most insidious victory wasn't measured in corpses or abandoned villages. It was written in the DNA of European society itself, coded into the very foundations of how communities would organize themselves for centuries to come. The survivors didn't just rebuild their world, they fundamentally redesigned it, creating social structures that reflected their hard-won knowledge about how quickly everything could disappear. Property ownership, once a relatively fluid concept governed by feudal obligations and family traditions, became an obsession among plague survivors. When you've watched entire bloodlines vanish overnight, when you've inherited land because everyone with a better claim is buried beneath it, the idea of secure ownership takes on existential importance. Survivors developed elaborate documentation systems, created multiple copies of important papers, and established redundant claims to ensure their holdings couldn't simply evaporate with the next wave of disease. This obsession with documented ownership created new legal frameworks that prioritized written proof over traditional relationships or verbal agreements. Communities that had once operated on handshake deals and family reputation now demanded contracts, witnesses, and official seals for even minor transactions. The informal trust networks that had governed medieval commerce were replaced by formal legal structures designed to function even when most of the people involved were dead. The guild system, which had controlled craft production and training for centuries, was completely reimagined by survivors who understood that concentrating essential knowledge in small groups was a recipe for disaster. New guilds were larger, more inclusive, and focused heavily on documenting techniques that had previously been passed down only through direct apprenticeship. They created detailed manuals, maintained multiple masters in each specialty, and established networks between different communities to ensure that critical skills couldn't be lost through local catastrophes. These reformed guilds also developed new approaches to quality control that reflected plague-era priorities. Rather than focusing primarily on maintaining traditional standards and protecting established practitioners, they emphasized reliability, durability, and the ability to function with reduced supervision. Products had to be built to last because there might not be craftsmen available to repair or replace them quickly. Banking and credit systems evolved to accommodate the reality that borrowers and lenders might die before debts could be repaid. New financial instruments were created that could transfer obligations between generations, that accounted for population fluctuations, and that provided mechanisms for communities to maintain economic relationships, even when individual participants were lost. The sophisticated financial networks that would eventually fuel Renaissance commerce had their origins in plague survivors' need to create economic systems that could survive demographic catastrophes. Marriage law underwent revolutionary changes as communities grappled with the practical and emotional challenges of forming families in an uncertain world. New legal frameworks were developed that allowed for more flexible arrangements, that recognized the validity of relationships formed under emergency conditions, and that provided mechanisms for quickly dissolving unions when circumstances changed dramatically. The traditional emphasis on family approval and lengthy courtship periods gave way to more pragmatic approaches that prioritized rapid decision-making and adaptability. These changes in marriage law reflected deeper shifts in how survivors thought about family relationships and social obligations. The extended kinship networks that had provided social security in medieval society had been decimated by plague losses, forcing communities to develop new forms of mutual support that weren't based on blood relationships. Artificial families formed around shared survival experiences, professional associations, or simple geographic proximity became legally recognized and socially accepted in ways that would have been revolutionary before the plague. Educational systems were completely restructured around the principle that knowledge was too important to be concentrated in small groups of specialists. New schools emphasized broad-based learning that gave students basic competency in multiple areas rather than deep specialization in single subjects. The goal wasn't to create scholars or artists, but to produce individuals who could perform essential community functions if the usual experts were unavailable. This educational philosophy created a generation that was remarkably versatile, but often lacked the deep expertise that had characterized pre-plague craftsmanship and scholarship. They could do many things adequately, but few things exceptionally well. This shift toward generalization over specialization had profound implications for European intellectual and cultural development in the centuries that followed. Religious institutions faced the challenge of rebuilding not just their physical structures, but their entire approach to spiritual authority and community leadership. The failure of traditional religious explanations during plague years had created a crisis of credibility that couldn't be resolved simply by replacing dead clergy with new appointments. New theological frameworks emerged that placed greater emphasis on individual spiritual experience, practical moral guidance, and community-based religious practice, rather than hierarchical authority and abstract doctrine. These religious reforms created space for the kind of questioning and individual interpretation that would eventually fuel the Protestant Reformation. Survivors who had watched priests die alongside parishioners, who had seen prayers go unanswered while practical measures sometimes succeeded, developed a more pragmatic and less deferential relationship with religious authority that their children and grandchildren would inherit and expand upon. Urban planning in rebuilt communities reflected plague-era lessons about the dangers of overcrowding and the importance of being able to isolate infected areas quickly. New town layouts featured wider streets, better ventilation systems, and residential patterns that allowed for more effective quarantine measures if disease returned. Public spaces were designed to accommodate social distancing protocols, and building codes were established that prioritized health considerations over traditional aesthetic or economic concerns. These urban planning innovations created cities that looked and functioned differently from their medieval predecessors. The cramped maze-like street patterns that had characterized earlier towns gave way to more organized layouts that prioritized movement, air circulation, and emergency access. While these changes were initially motivated by disease prevention, they also created urban environments that were more conducive to commerce, communication, and social interaction under normal circumstances. Agricultural practices evolved to address the reality that farming communities might suddenly lose most of their workforce and need to maintain production with skeleton crews. New techniques were developed that required less intensive labor, that could be managed by smaller groups of workers, and that produced more reliable yields even under suboptimal conditions. The three-field system gave way to more flexible rotation patterns that could be adapted to changing population levels and labor availability. These agricultural innovations also reflected changed attitudes toward risk and planning. Survivors preferred crops that were hardy and reliable over those that might produce spectacular yields under perfect conditions, but could fail completely if circumstances changed. They developed seed storage systems that could maintain viable planting material for multiple years, and they established networks between communities that could provide mutual support during local crop failures. Trade relationships were restructured around the understanding that traditional commercial partnerships might be disrupted without warning by demographic catastrophes. New forms of commercial organization emerged that were less dependent on personal relationships and more focused on standardized practices that could continue functioning even when key individuals were lost. Contracts became more detailed and specific, quality standards were more rigorously defined, and dispute resolution mechanisms were designed to function with minimal personal intervention. These changes in commercial practice created the foundation for the more impersonal but also more reliable trade networks that would eventually span continents. The shift away from relationship-based commerce towards system-based commerce was initially a response to plague-era instability, but it proved to be more efficient and scalable under normal conditions as well. Military organization adapted to the reality that traditional feudal levies might not be available when needed, either because the nobles who owed military service were dead, or because their peasant soldiers had been decimated by disease. New military structures emerged that relied more heavily on professional soldiers, standardized training, and equipment that could be used effectively by troops with less specialized preparation. These military innovations also reflected changed attitudes toward authority and social hierarchy. Survivors who had seen traditional social structures collapse during plague years were less willing to accept military leadership based purely on birth or traditional privilege. New forms of military organization emerged that placed greater emphasis on demonstrated competence and practical leadership skills. Legal systems evolved to handle the complex property disputes and inheritance questions that arose when entire families disappeared within short periods. New laws were created that provided mechanisms for determining ownership when traditional inheritance patterns had been disrupted, that established time limits for claiming abandoned property, and that created procedures for managing estates when no clear heirs existed. These legal innovations required fundamental changes in how communities thought about property rights and social obligations. The feudal system's emphasis on personal relationships and hereditary obligations gave way to more abstract legal frameworks that could function even when the people who had created specific arrangements were no longer available to explain or enforce them. Taxation systems were redesigned to account for dramatic population fluctuations and the possibility that traditional revenue sources might disappear without warning. New forms of taxation emerged that were based more on productive capacity and less on fixed assessments tied to specific individuals or properties. Tax collection mechanisms were simplified and made more flexible to ensure that essential government functions could continue even when administrative personnel were limited. These taxation innovations created more efficient and responsive government financing systems that could adapt quickly to changing circumstances. While initially developed to handle plague-related disruptions, these more flexible approaches to public finance proved superior to traditional methods under normal conditions as well. Social welfare systems emerged from survivors' recognition that traditional family and community support networks couldn't be relied upon to care for vulnerable individuals when demographic catastrophes struck. New institutions were created to provide care for orphans, the elderly, and the disabled that didn't depend entirely on kinship relationships or voluntary charity. These early welfare systems were rudimentary by modern standards, but they represented a fundamental shift in thinking about community responsibility and individual security. The idea that society as a whole had obligations to care for its most vulnerable members, rather than leaving such care entirely to families or religious institutions, had its origins in plague survivors' understanding of how quickly traditional support systems could collapse. Communication networks were strengthened and diversified to ensure that communities could maintain contact with each other even when normal travel and trade routes were disrupted. New systems were developed for sharing information about disease outbreaks, resource availability, and security threats that didn't depend on single individuals or easily disrupted communication chains. These communication improvements had implications far beyond disease prevention. Better information networks facilitated more efficient commerce, more effective governance, and more rapid spread of technological and cultural innovations. The infrastructure created to handle plague-era emergencies became the foundation for the communication systems that would eventually connect all of Europe. The cumulative effect of all these institutional changes was the creation of a society that was simultaneously more resilient and more individualistic than its medieval predecessor. Survivors had learned that traditional authorities and social structures couldn't be relied upon during crises, so they created new institutions that were designed to function with minimal central coordination and maximum local autonomy. This shift toward decentralized, resilient social organization had profound implications for European political and cultural development. The emphasis on documentation, standardization, and systematic approaches that emerged from plague-era necessities created the foundation for the bureaucratic and scientific thinking that would characterize the early modern period. The plague survivors didn't just rebuild their world, they built it better. Their innovations in law, commerce, education, and social organization created institutions that were more efficient, more equitable, and more adaptable than their predecessors. While these changes were initially motivated by the need to survive in a world that had been fundamentally destabilized by mass death, they proved to be improvements that benefited society under normal conditions as well. The Black Death forced Europeans to question every assumption about how society should be organized and to rebuild their institutions from the ground up, based on hard-won practical experience rather than inherited tradition. The result was a civilization that was more pragmatic, more flexible, and more focused on results than the one it replaced. These institutional innovations created the foundation for the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, and eventually the modern world. The survivors of the Black Death didn't just live through humanity's greatest catastrophe, they used the experience to create a better way of organizing human society. Their legacy isn't just survival, it's transformation. The psychological scars that individual survivors carried were transmitted into institutional DNA that would shape European civilization for centuries to come. Every law they wrote, every school they founded, every trade agreement they negotiated reflected their understanding that stability was fragile, that knowledge was precious, and that survival required constant vigilance and careful preparation. The world they built was harder in some ways than the one they had lost, less trusting and more demanding, but it was also more honest about human limitations and more realistic about the challenges of maintaining civilization in an uncertain world. The plague survivors created institutions that could survive the worst that history could throw at them. And in doing so, they created the foundation for everything that followed. The rebuilding wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something stranger, something that would haunt European consciousness for generations. Because here's what nobody talks about when they discuss the Black Death's aftermath: the waiting, the endless gnawing certainty that it would come back. And it did, again and again. Picture this: you've survived the initial outbreak. You've buried your family, learned new skills, maybe even found some measure of prosperity in the chaos. Life starts to feel almost normal again. Then someone mentions that ships from the east have been arriving with fewer crew members than usual. Or a trader talks about strange deaths in a village 2 days' ride away. Suddenly, that familiar ice-cold dread settles back into your chest, like an old friend you never wanted to see again. The plague returned in waves throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, sometimes every few years, sometimes after a decade of deceptive peace. Each resurgence brought its own particular horror because survivors knew exactly what was coming. They'd lived through it once and understood that their previous survival had been luck, not immunity. This created a form of collective anxiety disorder that infected entire communities. People developed what we might recognize today as hypervigilance on a societal scale. Every unusual death was scrutinized for plague symptoms. Every merchant ship was viewed with suspicion. Every cough in church made congregations tense. The psychological impact of living under this constant threat was devastating in ways that medieval chroniclers struggled to describe. Survivors found themselves trapped between the need to rebuild and invest in the future, and the knowledge that everything they created might be swept away again without warning. How do you plant an orchard when you're not sure you'll live to see it bear fruit? How do you raise children when you know that loving them might mean watching them die? Some communities developed elaborate early warning systems. networks of messengers who could carry news of outbreaks from town to town faster than the disease itself could spread. These information networks were crude but sometimes effective, allowing communities to prepare for quarantine or evacuation when plague approached their borders. But preparation itself became a form of torture. Families would spend months stockpiling food and supplies, only to consume their emergency stores during false alarms. Communities would isolate themselves from all outside contact based on rumours that later proved unfounded. The cost of constant readiness was almost as devastating as the plague itself. The few surviving physicians and healers found themselves in impossible positions, trying to distinguish between ordinary illnesses and the early stages of plague outbreaks. Every fever patient became a potential harbinger of community destruction. Every unexplained death triggered panic that could last for weeks. Medical knowledge, such as it was, became increasingly focused on early detection rather than treatment. Doctors developed elaborate diagnostic criteria for identifying plague cases, but these guidelines were often based more on fear than understanding. The slightest deviation from normal health patterns could result in families being forcibly quarantined or expelled from their communities entirely. The returning waves of plague also revealed how little survivors had actually learned about preventing infection. Despite their traumatic experience, most communities continued to blame the disease on supernatural causes, bad air, or divine punishment rather than developing effective public health measures. They repeated the same mistakes over and over, watching the same patterns of transmission and death unfold with horrifying familiarity. Children who grew up during the interplague periods lived with a particular kind of psychological burden. They were raised by adults who constantly spoke about the next outbreak as a certainty, not a possibility. Their entire childhood was structured around preparation for a catastrophe they had never experienced, but which dominated every aspect of their upbringing. These children developed coping mechanisms that were both remarkably sophisticated and deeply unhealthy. They learned to form shallow emotional attachments that could be severed quickly when necessary. They became expert at reading adult anxiety levels and adjusting their behavior to avoid triggering panic. They grew up old before their time, carrying responsibilities and knowledge that should have belonged to adults. When plague did return to these communities, the psychological impact was often worse than during the initial outbreak. Survivors who had rebuilt their lives, who had dared to hope that the worst was behind them, found themselves facing the complete collapse of everything they had worked to create. The second and third waves didn't just kill bodies, they killed the faith that recovery was possible. Some survivors developed what we might recognize as learned helplessness, becoming passive in the face of returning plague because their previous efforts to prepare and protect had proven ineffective. They would simply accept infection and death as inevitable, making no effort to flee or fight because they had learned that resistance was futile. Others went to the opposite extreme, developing increasingly elaborate and desperate preventive measures that consumed their entire lives. They would move constantly, fleeing from community to community at the first sign of disease. They would live in complete isolation, avoiding all human contact for years at a time. They would perform complex rituals and follow strict dietary regimens based on half-understood theories about what might provide protection. The economic impact of recurring plague waves was particularly devastating because communities never had enough time between outbreaks to fully recover. Just as trade networks were being re-established, as agricultural production was returning to normal levels, as craft skills were being retransmitted, another wave would arrive and destroy everything again. This created a vicious cycle where each outbreak left communities less prepared for the next one. The infrastructure and knowledge base that might have provided better protection were repeatedly destroyed before they could mature. Europe spent centuries in a state of perpetual rebuilding that never quite achieved stability. Religious responses to recurring plague became increasingly desperate and extreme. The failure of prayer and penance to prevent the initial outbreak had already shaken faith in traditional Christianity. When the disease returned despite renewed religious devotion, many communities abandoned conventional worship entirely or turned to increasingly radical forms of spiritual expression. Some areas saw the rise of apocalyptic cults that proclaimed the end times had arrived and that all earthly preparation was meaningless. Others witnessed the emergence of new forms of popular religion that incorporated folk magic, pagan elements, and desperate bargaining with any supernatural forces that might offer protection. The flagellant movements that had emerged during the first plague outbreak returned with each new wave, often becoming more extreme and violent. These groups would travel from town to town, performing increasingly elaborate rituals of self-punishment while preaching that only through absolute suffering could communities hope to appease divine wrath. Political structures that had been rebuilt after the initial plague collapse found themselves repeatedly destabilized by new outbreaks. Rulers who had managed to establish some measure of authority and legitimacy would see their power evaporate when plague returned and their subjects either died or fled. Governments that had begun to develop effective administrative systems would lose their trained personnel and have to start over from scratch. This political instability created opportunities for ambitious individuals, but also made long-term governance nearly impossible. Laws that were enacted during healthy periods might be completely irrelevant when plague returned. Treaties between communities might become meaningless when one or both parties no longer existed in any meaningful form. The cumulative psychological effect of living through multiple plague waves was the creation of a society that had internalized the expectation of catastrophe. Europeans of the late medieval period lived with a constant awareness that everything they valued could disappear without warning. This expectation shaped their art, their literature, their philosophy, and their approach to daily life in ways that would persist for centuries. Art from this period is filled with images of death, decay, and the fragility of human existence. The famous memento mori tradition, which reminded viewers that death could come at any moment, wasn't just philosophical reflection, but lived experience for people who had watched entire communities vanish repeatedly. Literature became obsessed with themes of impermanence, lost love, and the futility of human ambition. The courtly romances and heroic epics that had characterized earlier medieval culture gave way to darker works that emphasized the randomness of fate and the impossibility of achieving lasting happiness or security. So there you have it, the untold horror of surviving the Black Death. We've walked through the psychological wasteland left behind by Europe's greatest catastrophe, seen how the lucky ones who escaped infection faced a different kind of death, the slow erosion of everything that made life worth living. From the crushing isolation to the breakdown of human touch, from children raised in the shadow of trauma, to institutions rebuilt from the ground up by people who had learned that everything could disappear without warning. Survival wasn't victory. It was just the beginning of a different kind of suffering, one that would reshape European civilization for centuries to come. The plague didn't just kill bodies, it killed ways of being human that had existed for thousands of years. And perhaps most chilling of all, it taught an entire continent to live in constant expectation that the worst was always yet to come. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.